Welcome to my January to June 2019 reading summary. In this video I'm going to show you some graphs and statistics and pie charts and things of my reading in the first half of 2019. I do my monthly summaries, but I thought it would also be nice to show an overview of the first half of the year with some extra graphs that I don't normally show in my monthly summaries. In 2019 I read 119 books so far this year. Obviously we're only looking at half of the year. Most of the other years that you see in this graph have the whole year other than the first one. So the number for 2019 will be, I'm not sure if it will quite be the double or whether it will be a bit under that. In 2019 I read 28,967 pages in the year so far. This graph you have seen before, and it shows the amount of books I've read per month. And you've also seen this pie chart before if you've seen my most recent monthly summary of June. And then we have the pages per month and the pages per month in the pie chart. Then we get to the amount of books that were new to me versus the amount of rereads. About 90% of the books that I read were new to me books. About 9% was a reread and 1% was a combination. So the combination was a book with short stories, and I had read some of these stories before but not others. Here we can see the rereads per month and also the amount of new books per month. About 63% of the books I read were books that I already owned, and 37% were books that came from the library. So about a third versus two-thirds, sort of, but not quite. Then we get to the format of the books. Almost half of the books I read were paperbacks. And this is my favorite format, so I'm not surprised. 42% were hardbacks with no dust jacket. These are mainly library loans, because books from libraries in the Netherlands are given like a hard cover without a dust jacket. So I think most of these were the library loans with maybe a few extra books that I owned. About 10% of the books I read were hardcovers with dust jackets, and I haven't actually read any digital books yet this year so far. Then we get to the gender of the author. About 1/3 of the books that I read so far in 2019 had a male author, 44% had a female author, and 22% had more than one author, in which not all the authors have the same gender, if that makes sense, and 1% was written by a non-binary author. Then we get to the nationality of the author. Just over a third of books were written by people from the United States, 14% were from the UK, 17% were from the Netherlands, 9% from Japan, 9% from Italy, and then we have a bunch of countries that I read like a couple of books from. For example, Germany, Belgium, Russia, Canada, Finland, Ivory Coast. And 5% of the authors I was either not sure what country they were from, or it was a combination. For example, they were born in one country and they were living in another country, so I wasn't quite sure. So that goes under the 5% of like being a combination. 1/3 of the books that I read so far this year were written by new to me authors, and about 63% of the books were written by familiar to me authors, and 4% was a combination. These are books that are written by more than one author, in which case I was familiar with one and unfamiliar with another, sort of thing. 36% of the books I read so far this year were standalones, and 45% were part of series. 19% were a combination, and these are mainly children's books, in which case it is part of a series with like the same characters, but it's not important that you read all the books in order, because each book is kind of a standalone story, if that makes sense. So that's why I've classified those as a combination. Then we get to the book type. About 2/3 of the books that I read so far this year were novels, 9% were short story or short story collections, 5% was part of an omnibus, 3% were information books, 14% were biographies and memoirs, and 2% were picture books. Then we get to the genres I've read so far this year. 21% was fantasy, 9% science fiction, 26% contemporary fiction, 2% rom-com or chick lit, 8% historical fiction, 1% literature, 3% detective and mystery, 2% thriller, 3% horror, 2% paranormal, 13% biographies and memoirs, 7% information, 2% Disney and 1% art. There were a couple of books that had more than one genre, so that is also included in this graph. I think it's a nice spread of genres, so I'm happy with this. And this pie chart shows the pages per genre. So the previous one was how many books I read per genre. This one is taking the amount of pages into account. And what we see here is that some genres get a slightly smaller slice of the pie, so to speak, and others get a bigger slice. For example, historical fiction gets a little bit of a bigger slice now, whereas fantasy and contemporary fiction both get a little bit smaller slice. Science fiction becomes a bit bigger, etc. And this graph shows chronologically the amount of pages per book. I realize this is maybe a bit of a difficult one to interpret if you haven't seen this before, but one thing it definitely shows is that more recently, so that is on the right hand side of the graph, I've been reading some more bigger books, whereas in the beginning of the year, so on the left hand side, I mostly read some more smaller and medium-sized books. Yeah, I just thought it interesting to include this one. This graph shows sort of the format of the book. So about a quarter of the books I read were textbooks. So this means that the book contains mostly text. 1% of the books was written in verse. 34% of the books were illustrated. 9% of the books were manga. 7% were comics. And 23% were graphic novels and graphic memoirs. 2% were picture books. Then we get to the age range of the books I read. 2% were books intended for infants. Those are picture books. 44% were children's books. So this is from like ages 4 to 12. 27% of the books were for young adults. So that's 12 to 18. And 27% of the books I read were for adults. And when I say were for, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be of that age category to read the book, but that's like the intended market sort of. But I'm sure you get that. So in this graph you can see a per genre with which age range those books that I read in that genre came from. So for example, I have read quite a lot of contemporary fiction for children's and young adult, but not much for adults. Whereas, for example, most of the biographies that I've read were intended for adults, and the same for information books. Whereas I am a bigger fan of children's horror than adult horror, so all of the horror books that I've read this year so far are intended for children. So for historical fiction, most of the historical fiction books I read this year were intended for children, and so on. Then for fiction versus non-fiction, 81% of the books I read were fiction, 17% of the books were non-fiction, and 2% was a combination. I read a couple of books that had both fictional elements as well as that they were trying to teach you some information. So I've classified those as a combination. Then the language of books that I've read so far this year. 61% of the books I read were written in English and 39% were written in Dutch. For the original language that the book was originally written in, 56% of the books I read were originally written in English, 19% was originally written in Dutch, 9% in Italian, 2% French, 3% in German, 9% in Japanese and 2% in Finnish. 69% of the books I read in their original language and 31% was a translation. So about 1/3 was translation and 2/3 was original. Then we get to the publication years. This is the publication years of the copies I read. We'll get to the original publication years. So most of the books I read were published in the last 10 years, with a few of them published in the 2000s and the 1990s. When we spread this out a bit more, about 10% of the books that I read this year so far were published in 2019, 22% were published in 2018, 26% in 2017, 9% in 2016, and then we go on with some smaller slices from earlier years. And when I look at the original publication years, it is a bit the same thing with the 1980s now also having a little bit of books. There was, I think, one book where I wasn't sure when it was published, or where it was maybe an omnibus and it was published in various years, so that's that one bit to the very right. And then we look at original publication years in a pie chart, and it is a bit similar as the one for publication years, with some more of them going back. It's a little bit confusing because some double colors are used by the program, but the first 3% in the graph is from the 1980s. And then we get to later. I used to read some a bit more older books, that's why I still have the classification for those years, but this year I haven't really read any older books, so. Then in this graph you can see both the publication years and the original publication years, and I thought this was an interesting overview of both. Then we get to the gender of the protagonist. 34% of the books I read, the main character was male, 46% had a female protagonist, 18% had more than one main character, in which case there was characters of different genders as a protagonist. 1% was non-binary, and 1% of the books didn't really have a main character to speak of, so that's why I marked them as non-applicable. Then the writing style of the books that I read, 41% was mostly written in first person, 20% was written in third person, 39% was a combination, and these are mostly graphic novels, manga, comics, but also I read some books that used both first and third person. 33% of the books was written in past tense, 20% was written in present tense, and 47% was a combination. So these are again graphic novels, manga, comics, but also some books that actually both use past and present tense. Mostly books written in first person, in which so the main character talks about the now, but there are also flashbacks in the story that are written in past tense. Yeah. A debut versus the non-debut. 20% of the books I read were the debut books by those authors. 75% were non-debut books. 1% was a combination, and 4% I was unable to find the information whether it was an author's debut or not. These are, I think, mostly like older Dutch books, and information about that is a lot harder to find, whether that is actually their debut book or not. So yeah. Then we get to page numbers. 64% of the books that I read were less than 250 pages. 34% was 250 to 500 pages, and only 2% were 500 plus page books. So I've definitely been reading a lot more shorter books this year, which is also those graphic novels and comics. The manga, those are generally not that many pages. So I must work more on reading a few more longer books, I think. Then we get to page numbers, but then in not in a pie chart, but then in a different kind of graph. So less than 5% of the books had less than 100 pages. Most of the books I read were like between 100 and 399 pages. That is by far the most of them. And then some more books that were 400 plus pages, etc. I read one book that was between 700 and 799 pages, and I read one book that was more than 1,000 pages. Then the genres per month. At the moment, that average on the right obviously is a lot lower than what I actually read in January through June, because at the moment the average also takes the last 6 months of the year into account, and I read nothing yet in those months, so that's why the average, yeah, that one's not entirely accurate right now, but yeah. Then we have the cover and the spine colors. With this, I take the color that is most prominent on the cover, and if it is a bit of an even split between two or multiple colors, then I put multi. As you can see, I read quite a lot of books that had a multicolored cover, but spines generally do have a specific color. I read a lot of blue books this year. I think I do in most years. Blue is my favorite color, so somehow that is not surprising. I read some of each color, but I find it interesting to see that apparently some colors are used more for the spine, whereas other colors are maybe used more on the cover, stuff like that. At least out of the books I read, which is of course not at all representative of all the books that are out there. But yeah, I find it interesting to track this. Then we get to the amount of words in the title. I started tracking this because I was curious, and for this year I've just left it in there. Most of the books I read had 2, 3 or 4 words in the title, with some books having 1 word in the title and others 5, and 6 or more words is less common. The scale of this is the amount of books read, by the way. I realize it doesn't say that, but I can tell you that. Now, we have some graphs coming up in relation to diversity. This is the first year that I'm tracking that. I might decide to do things a little bit differently next year, but this is how I've done it this year. The first pie chart says that 51% of the books I read had a diverse main character or cast of characters, 28% had no diversity to speak of, and in 21% of the books there was some diversity in the books, but that was more related to like side characters and things like that. Then this next pie chart has to do with trigger warnings. 28% of the books I read, I would say they should come with some sort of trigger warning, and 72% I would not say they need that. Yeah, I don't really know why I'm tracking this, but I thought I might as well. This is more about hard-hitting topics and things like that. Then we get to diversity for the main character of the book. 12% of the books had some kind of neurodiversity in the main character. 25% had to do with mental health. 11% had to do with LGBT plus elements. 24% had to do with people of color. 13% with disability, and 15% with health and illness. So this is only including, of course, the books that had diverse main characters. The next graph is looking at the diversity in total, so also of the side characters. In this case, 10% of the books had neurodiverse characters. 23% was about mental health, 14% LGBT+, person of color was 26%, disability 12%, and health and illness 15%. So for example, the person of color slice went up because I have also read some books where a side character was a person of color, or like the second most important character was a person of color. Then we get to type of diversity, when we also include books that had not much diversity to speak of. 11% had neurodiversity, 13% mental health, 15% LGBT+, 28% person of color, 3% disability, 10% mental illness, and 20% none. This is the first year that I'm tracking this, as I said, so it is possible that there might still be some errors somewhere in how I track it, but if I find them, I will fix it. Keep in mind that some books have multiple diversity, and in that case, they get a bit for both of those categories, or multiple of those categories. And now we get to the individual graphs for the diversities. So 15% has a neurodiverse main character, 83% has no neurodiversity to speak of in the book, and 2% had a neurodiverse side character. Then we get to mental health. 32% of the books I read had some kind of mental health representation in the main character. 65% did not have that, and 3% had some mental health representation, but it was more for a side character or something like that. 14% of the books I read had a main character that was LGBT+, 74% did not, and 12% had a side character or something that was LGBT. Then we get to the person of color. 30% of the books I read had a main character that was a person of color, or had a, in the case of an ensemble cast, most of the ensemble cast was a person of color. 54% did not have a person of color as the main character, and 16% had like a side character, or in the case of an ensemble cast, like 1 or 2 of those characters were people of color. Then we get to disability. 17% of the books I read had a main character with a disability, 81% did not, and 2% of the books had a side character with a disability. Then we get to health and illness, and there is a bit of overlap between health and illness and disability, as well as neurodiversity and disability. 19% of the books had an element of health and illness in the main character. 76% did not, and 5% of the books had this element in a side character. And the last graph is how many days it took me to read a book. So about 2/3 of the books I read in 1 day. These are mostly graphic novels, comics, manga, things like that. 13% of the books took me 2 days, 5% took me 3 days, 5% took me 4 days, 2% took me 5 days, 2% took me 6 days, 3% took me 7 days, 2% took me 8 days, and 1% took me 9 days, and 1% took me more than 10 days, and that one was the really big book I read, and that took me 30 days. That concludes my January to June 2019 reading summary. That's all the graphs I have to show you for now. I hope you enjoyed this video and this look into seeing some of the graphs and things that I use to track my statistics. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in my next one. Bye!